Hi, and welcome to The Caption Life, a show for the most casual and dedicated fans of comics and a member of the Comic Watch family. I'm your host, Sean. Join me and discover what the world of comics and graphic novels have to offer. From one-on-one interviews with industry professionals, roundtable discussions with passionate fans, and reviews on the latest comics, TV shows, and movies. Now let's dive right on in. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the show. In this episode, we are going to discuss a popular comic series by Mad Cave Studios called Nottingham, specifically Volume 2, A King's Ransom, which is now on sale and is available at your local comic shop. Here's a description of the series. When Richard the Lionheart is kidnapped and ransomed by Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI, Everard Blackthorne, the Sheriff of Nottingham, is strong-armed into delivering the ransom and bringing the king home on penalty of death. The treacherous Prince John and his ally, King Philip of France, will stop at nothing to ensure that Richard remains in captivity, so the sheriff finds the unlikeliest of allies in none other than Robin Hood and the Merry Men. With Robin and the sheriff away, Marian hatches her own devious plan to take back Nottingham, and this collects Nottingham issues number 6 through 10. I have the exciting opportunity to have the author of the series and a returning guest of the show, David Hazan, join us today. David is a comic book writer, best known as the writer and co-creator of the hit comic series Nottingham. He is a lover of soulful stories with magnetic characters and has enjoyed collaborating with publishers such as AfterShock, Mad Cave Studios, Scout, and more. He currently resides in and writes from the koala-infested Upside Down known as Melbourne, Australia. David, welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so how have things been since we last interviewed you last year?
I mean, busy. It's kind of wild. Yeah, obviously we talked about how the first volume blew up, and we're sort of maintaining steam on this second volume. People seem to be loving it. So my work in comics has just exponentially grown, and I'm really excited about that.
Oh, good. Yeah, I mean it's honestly, it's one of my favorite stories out there that, and we talked about this in the last episode as well, too, of taking a folklore story like this and just kind of flipping on its head. It's just so well done. And I can see why it got popular, overnight, and that it got a volume 2. And this one, it was really good as well, too. So I wanted to ask you, what is your comic book origin story? Was there someone or something that introduced you to comics? And what is it that made you a comic book fan to begin with?
I feel like I'd always been consuming comic book related media, but was always discouraged as a kid from reading comics. And it was only maybe about 4 or 5 years ago that someone, a very kind and frustrated work colleague, got annoyed at me talking about comic book media without actually reading the source material, and shoved a copy of the Rucker Williams Batwoman elegy into my hands.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of just, my love of comics has kind of snowballed ever since.
That's awesome. It's awesome in the sense that that's an interesting story that I haven't heard I haven't heard something like that before. So it's very unique and interesting to hear that's how it started for you.
Yeah. Sometimes I feel like I'm playing catch up when all of my peers are like, have been in this world, since since they were kids. But
Mm-hmm.
I think it also gives me a different perspective.
Right.
I don't know, it seems to work.
Well, and I feel you with that as well, too, because I love comic books growing up. But then when I got into high school, I got away from it and just got back into reading comics about 5 years ago, actually. And what's interesting is I see and hear people talk about all these stories all the time. And I feel like I'm trying to catch up with everything that I missed out on as well, too. So I feel you in that it feels like you're always in constant catch up mode when it comes to comics. So,
yeah. And I'm like, when you're writing comics, it's really hard, and you have to force yourself to read comics too sometimes.
Right.
Even though it's an enjoyable experience, it's like your head is in comics all the time. So the last thing you want to do is go and read something. So usually I have to find something I'm really excited about. But yeah, it falls down the list, and then you fall further and further behind.
Oh yeah, yeah. We always talk about like our unread piles and everything. Just how we have stacks of comics that we haven't read or anything like that. But yeah, I mean, you definitely need to have something that you enjoy that's kind of outside of comics, so that way you're not always immersed and always thinking and dreaming and eating and sleeping the same thing over and over again, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So the last time we had you on the show, we talked to you about volume one, which was called Death and Taxes. And we talked about how fascinating your story was with these classic tales. So when you started to work on the next volume issues, what was that process like for you? Did you already have an idea of what the story is going to be like when you started on it?
I had a pretty good idea. I kind of knew when I started, about midway between issue 4 and 5, I think at some point,
Mm-hmm.
I kind of had an idea of how we would continue the story and how the story would end.
Mm-hmm.
So
Nice. Oh, good. What when you were working on this second volume, what was the most exciting part about working on it, and what do you felt like was the most challenging part with writing the second volume?
I think the most exciting part was like really getting to develop these characters a little more, and kind of take ownership of them a little more, because I feel like in the first volume we got to subvert the reader's expectations, but we
Mm-hmm.
were still leaning on the crutch of the original stories. And now that we kind of like established a status quo, I was like, great, we're going to shatter all of this and do something completely unexpected. And that was the most fun, I suppose. I don't know. Writing Nottingham mostly comes easily to me. I'm like writing other stuff at the moment, which is much more difficult to write. And
Mm-hmm.
kind of looking back on it, I didn't struggle with a lot. I think there are like the logistical things. So like making sure that characters were in the right place at the right time and fitting the amount of story that I needed to into each issue sometimes was a challenge.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but beyond that, like I just love writing these characters. It really is a joy, and like, I don't say that as some sort of platitude. I genuinely like just love writing these characters.
Right. Yeah. Well, and as I mentioned before, I think it's really fascinating because for those who haven't read the story yet, it's taking that folklore story of what we've grown up with and completely changing it to be a different kind of story. It's almost like what we've seen with I forget the author's name, but like what they did with the Wizard of Oz and how they wrote Wicked. It's like taking that story and kind of flipping it. And I love that kind of story. And that's exactly what you did here. And it's one of those stories that is just really suspenseful because you're never quite sure what's going on, what you thought about Robin Hood, and that story like doesn't apply here necessarily, and that you never know what's going to happen next. And it's very unexpected. And I gotta say, hearing you talk about volume one and how you flipped everything on its head, I remember thinking, how are you going to surprise us in volume two? And reading volume two, I'm just like, yeah, I'm surprised again. And so you did a great job of just at keeping at the success of what made volume one really good, and doing that in volume two, it just kept continuing the story that didn't really skip a beat or anything like that, and that it's just really fascinating to see how you can tell the story and just kind of surprise us with whatever we thought we knew about the story you can just throw that out the window because you're not going to know what happens here. So yeah, I can see why you enjoy writing these characters, because they really shine through in the issues that I've been reading and everything, and that it's just really fascinating to kind of relearn and get to know these characters again in a different kind of world or universe. And I love that about this comic.
Yeah, and I'm very lucky that most people's first comic doesn't go for 11 issues so far, really.
Mm-hmm.
And most people don't get that long to tell their stories. So what I really wanted to do with volume 2 was make it kind of the Empire Strikes Back of the series.
Yeah.
I I like I think that was like you don't get a better sequel than Empire, right? And I
Yeah.
was like, well, how do I do this? All right, well, I'm gonna like change everything.
Right. Yeah. Oh yeah, and that really feels like that's what happened here with volume 2. So when you write a story that's based on a legend like Robin Hood and change the story elements of it, is there a certain framework or a certain set of rules that goes into writing a story like that? Like, are there things that you can't change and other things are just pretty much free game, or do you make your own rules? What's that process like?
Um, I don't think I really had a set of rules. I think it's all dictated one by genre. And so while we've kind of pivoted in terms of genre a little bit, we've still got noir elements in this volume.
Hmm.
Um, and so it's dictated one by the genre because the genre has its own tropes that we kind of need to make sure we hit on.
Hmm.
And uh, like part of the fun is fitting the legend into the kinds of story structures and kinds of character archetypes
Hmm.
that make noir so fun.
Hmm.
um and then the other thing is making sure that theme like rings true throughout the thing. So as long as we're hitting on message and still bringing a different genre take uh, to the story, everything's fair game. I did play a little bit with the history in this volume. Admittedly, I wanted that final confrontation to take place in Rome,
Hmm.
which meant that I had to do a little bit of uh, tweaking of the history. But if anybody pays careful attention to some of the dialogue in issue 6, uh, you'll kind of understand where I did it and why.
Well, and that actually goes into my next question about this is um just like what you said, the folklore story of Robin Hood is one that is rooted around a historical event, particularly during the Crusades, right? Like when we look at some of the other folklore or fairy tales that we look at, it's not rooted in those kinds of historical events the same way that Robin Hood is. So like King Arthur, Cinderella, Snow White, all those things, they are stories that were told in history, but Robin Hood is very central to, you can't tell the story of Robin Hood without really talking about these actual historical events that happen. And so with this volume, there's a lot of historical references that was in it that you said, and it was clear that you did a lot of your research on the historical period, and we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a second. But I wanted to ask you, what do you do that you find helps you in your process when you do that research? And what might compel you to include like that certain historical fact or event in your story when you're looking at those historical pieces or those historical events and facts when you're writing this volume for Nottingham?
The answer to this question is like the most simple answer, which is that the story ideas come from the history. Like
Hmm.
that's where I got the idea for this volume,
Uh-huh.
which was I was like, how do we like pull apart these characters and put them back together, create new relationships, um, and do something interesting. My initial idea for the second volume kind of was, I guess, more traditional story set in Nottingham, and I just kind of decided to leapfrog that and go to the interesting historical event that was next, which was the kidnapping and ransom of Richard the Lionheart.
Hmm.
And I'm very glad that I did that because like it really propels the story forward rather than kind of navel gazing on the legend itself. We're like, okay, now we've spent 5 issues navel gazing. Now let's do something wild and fun and interesting, which is still referable to the history.
Hmm.
So and like my historical research is mostly Googling. I don't think I read a single book because like that's part of the fun of this. Like we get
Yeah.
to like especially when you're playing with folklore, like when you think about, like, Wikipedia is just like pretty much it's like oral history written down sometimes, because often there's no sources. That's part of the fun, you
Right.
know.
Yeah.
Um, and like, of course, a huge part of the Robin Hood tradition is like these oral, tales and these ballads that eventually get recorded. And
Hmm.
yeah, it's just me getting ideas for the next volume, specifically when to set the next volume,
Hmm.
and the historical backdrop for the next volume comes from the history.
Right. Right. And you've mentioned the historical stories about King Richard, which is something I wanted to bring up because this series, this volume, just as you mentioned, it's called A King's Ransom, is centered around them trying to get King Richard back, and you included some of the historical factual stories into your volume that I really find intriguing and interesting. So, for example, how he was kidnapped. I don't think there's been any sort of interpretation of Robin Hood or interpretation of Robin Hood in any sort of media that told that part of the story in Robin Hood that King Richard was kidnapped. And you also included how King Richard had treated the Jewish people as coronation as well, too, which again, to my memory, I have not seen any sort of interpretation that told that part of the story as well, too. So I want to ask you, what was it about those, not just, necessarily those, but I want to bring those two out just as examples here. What was it about those events that you thought was important to include in this story, especially knowing that this is not something that it's told in a lot of the Robin Hood, interpretations and stories that we see in film or shows or, other books and things like that?
Yeah, well, the Ransom of King Richard is a really it's a really interesting political event.
Hmm.
And like the whole theme that we're approaching in Nottingham is how the politics affects the individual common man, right?
Hmm.
That's and Ev, while he's got really one foot in, a higher status, he's still, and you can see he's still kind of sandwiched between the two classes, which means he's kind of an avatar of the common man. And
Hmm.
so, like, the idea that Ev is just being like pushed around by these political forces and has no say and has to do the best that he can with what he's got,
Hmm.
um, was really interesting to me. The second part, which is the sort of historical anti-Semitism stuff,
Hmm.
is uh, I was trying to think about how, like, why is the sheriff, like, his story is basically a transcription of of anti-Semitic stereotypes. And so
Hmm.
I was like, well, what if he was Jewish? And so I went down my little, like, Googling Wikipedia rabbit hole,
Hmm.
and like found out that 1189, King Richard's coronation, was the first, and the events that followed was the first time the word Holocaust was ever used to
Hmm.
describe anti-Semitic violence.
Hmm.
And I was like, well, I think this is happening. Like this, the pieces all fit together so well when I kind of went down that rabbit hole, that I was like, look, guess this is what I'm doing.
Hmm.
And I really think it's also an important thing to talk about, which is that, there are a lot of these ideas. The Nazis didn't come up with a single one of them.
Right.
They've existed for thousands of years, and you know what? They're still around, and it's awful, and
Right.
it should stop.
Yeah.
And like, it was a way to tell an important story to me, honor my own heritage, and honor the history itself.
Hmm.
Um, and yeah, I'm really satisfied with how that turned out, and
Hmm.
particularly the page that Shane and Luca did in that issue, where they delve into that, was
Hmm.
just like Shane. Shane doing an art style that wasn't Shane was a surprise to me. Like,
Hmm.
it was still him, but he, like, his thing is like the really heavy inks, and he just got rid of all the heavy inks, and it was just the final lines. I was like, this is incredible still, obviously.
Right. Yeah.
And then Luca did something different with the colors, and it just, you know, pretty incredible stuff.
Yeah. Definitely. Well, and I was just thinking about how fitting it was for you to tell these historical stories within the narrative of Nottingham, and how to make it not just something that happened, but just like what you said, how it impacted the characters and the story, and the fact that the sheriff of Nottingham himself was Jewish, and had Jewish lineage, and how that plays a part of who he is in the story, I think is fascinating. And just the fact that these are facts that, again, I mentioned before, we don't see in a whole lot of other interpretations of Robin Hood, and makes a lot of sense to include it in your version of Nottingham, because it's, again, rethinking the whole story, and now rethinking the whole history of the events that happened as well too, by highlighting some of those things that we don't get to see in these mediums that we haven't seen before. So we all know that King Richard went off to the Crusades and he was gone, and Prince John was in charge and things like that. But to have some of these other parts that were more the darker chapters of the history part of it, I think was very. I remember when you had included that Holocaust in there. I guess I had forgotten about how the word Holocaust did exist before World War II, but I had just completely forgotten about it. And I didn't realize until I read your comic, like, how far back it went too. So I thought that was a really, really moving and compelling piece when you include that in there, that it really fit with your narrative and your story of Nottingham here. So I wanted to ask you a follow-up to that, of if there were any other interesting historical facts when you were doing your research that maybe didn't make into this volume or into any of these issues, because maybe it just didn't make sense, but you would love to try to see if you can incorporate that into maybe a future story somehow. And I don't
I'm
want
going
you
to
to
keep
give
this
away
one
like your
close
whole
to the
story
chest.
either.
I'm going to keep this one pretty close. But what I will say is that we we end volume 2 really at the beginning of 1194.
Mhm.
There is a big historical event that happens in Nottingham during 1194,
Mhm.
which uh, is it makes sense as the place to where I want to go next.
Gotcha.
But we're gonna have a think about how the balance of power changes that story a little bit. So
Mhm. Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, and that's totally
I,
fine. So
sorry if I'm being a bit cryptic. I just don't want to give the whole game away just
no,
yet.
no, that's totally fine. So I guess that kind of leads into this question I had is, it sounds like there's going to be another volume for Nottingham coming out at some point. Is that right?
Yes.
Awesome.
There is another volume. I'm in the middle of outlining now, so it's going to be a little bit. However, there will be some more Nottingham content coming next year that is
Hmm.
not volume 3, but I
Oh,
don't
really?
think I can say more beyond that. But it's
Oh,
really
it's so
exciting
awesome.
project. And I'm waiting to hear back on some final details about that, but like, I feel like it's gonna more news will come in the next few months.
Yeah.
By the time this airs, hopefully there'll be a little more news.
Right. Yeah, no, but that's honestly, that's exciting, because not only hearing about there's another volume, but an offshoot of something that's coming out. Like, I think that's something that speaks to volume of how successful this story has been. Not just for everybody who's been reading this, but I mean, just also for you to be able to tell just as many stories as you want with the universe that you've kind of created with Nottingham. I think is just really fantastic. So congratulations to you on being able to not only write another volume, but writing some of these new stories as well too. That's so great.
Thank you. The other thing that was a delight to write, and probably my favorite, really my favorite Nottingham story I've written, is the Free Comic Book Day issue this year. I don't know if you got a chance to take a peek at that, but
No, I saw it, but I don't think I had a chance to read that yet.
It kind of bridges the gap between volume 1 and 2, in the way that I wanted to put a whole volume in there, but it does its job of like illustrating the transition in Ev's own mind of where he sits at the end of volume 1 and where he starts volume 2. It's a standalone story. You'll be able to understand it if you haven't read volume 1. If you have read volume 1, you might cry, but yeah, it was just like a really enjoyable piece to write, especially the challenge of just writing like a standalone mystery in the Nottingham universe was like a joy.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. I'm going to have to go back and read that now that you brought that up. So that would be really exciting. One of the things I did want to ask you as well, too, because you brought this up in terms of talking about how Nottingham addresses and talks about the different class system that existed back then. And I find really interesting that we saw it in volume 1, but I think it got really expanded on in this volume just in terms of consequences and identity as well too, is the person of Robin Hood and how we always think of him as being, because he's part of the Merrymen, that he's one of the people of, the commoner and things like that. But in this story, we're kind of reminded that he was still, just as you said, have one foot in that world, but the other foot as part of the higher class system, where he was part of more the elite system, where he had more of a say in terms of these overall governing decisions that happened in England. And so I think it was really fascinating to see how that played out and how that impacted, him and his followers in this story here. And so I think what's really fascinating about all of this is that, again, looking at some of the other mediums, we tend to, romanticize Robin Hood as the commoner person, but forget about that part. And again, the character itself might be rooted in an actual person, but we don't know much about the actual person and everything. But we tend to romanticize the commoner part, but forget about how he also had a little bit more power than the common person here, and how that could be something that you really leverage in your story, how somebody in that position can really play politics and move both sides of the chessboard, so to speak. And I think you really did a great job of showing that here with the person of Robin Hood, and how he is somewhat, you never know what's going to happen with that particular character, because you thought you had him figured out, and then all of a sudden he kind of changed motives a little bit or changed sides and everything like that. And so I find it fascinating how you were able to really include that, incorporate that into the story here. And so I'm wondering if there are like other parts of the class system that you like to play around with the story that existed during that historical time, that maybe, for our listeners here that haven't read the story yet, might be fascinating to kind of talk about or expand on, in terms of how the class system kind of impacts the story here a little bit, and how that could change, what we're seeing in the story as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the idea itself came from my own cynicism, right? Where the modern interpretation of Robin Hood has him as a nobleman who crosses the fence, in the same way that like Oliver Queen is a billionaire who then who then takes up a bow and arrow and goes and fights crime, or a billionaire rather. The like the idea that Robin Hood, who has all the privileges and responsibilities of a nobleman, didn't sit quite right with me that he would, outlaw himself,
Mm-hmm.
uh, and kind of go into the forest and start up this kind of upstart guerrilla rebellion.
Right.
Uh, and so my that was where everything spun out of. And this volume in particular, I think, shows you the consequences of Robin mobilizing the rhetoric that he uses to manipulate the merry men,
Mm-hmm.
and what happens when he's not around to continue to propagandize.
Yeah.
Um, so he's basically using the merry men for his own ends,
Right.
and he's very specific about his goals
Mm-hmm.
when it comes to the merry men, and the person who's most acutely aware of that is Marian.
Right.
She
Yes.
sees that he'll go far, but not so far as to, upset the status quo.
Right.
And because you notice that, he pretty much took the castle, Nottingham Castle in volume one,
Mm-hmm.
but, he ends up getting defeated. But if he wanted to, you think he could probably have like killed everyone in the castle, but he didn't.
Right.
And Marian's like, look, Marian goes to Little John, and she's like, look, like you hate me. I don't really care. What I care about is that you're being used, and she does this purely for her own ends because she wants to use him rather than Robin. But she's saying, I'm willing to go much further than Robin would because I don't really care for the noble class. All I care about is, you know, gaining power and status and wealth.
Right.
So I'm prepared to go the distance in order to achieve that goal.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I'm sick of feeding off scraps that are left from these people. So are you. Let's do something about it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that dynamic shift is so exciting, because you get to give all of these characters agency where they didn't really have it in the first volume.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and we'll see as we go along who ends up getting bitten in the ass by by what they've done.
Yeah.
But she's certainly much more willing to, she's much more willing to upend the system than Robin ever was. Robin's goal was never to upend the system. Robin's goal was to make sure that King Richard had, a safe place to come home to by destabilizing Prince John, while also um, funding the war effort
Mm-hmm.
for Richard's return.
Right. Yeah. No, and I love that part. And I think it's really fascinating to kind of see how those different pieces of the system get to play with and interact with one another, in that, they're kind of in the same levels of status, or, they're different, but they're same in the sense of like where they're at, and along those lines and everything. And that those play a motive into that character as well too. And I thought it was just fantastic how you wrote that out. And especially Maid Marian. I gotta say, I think Maid Marian is one of my favorite ones, because you just never have any idea like what she's going to do next. And just like what you said, she's the one that will go the furthest in terms of what she's willing to do in order to achieve that. And I absolutely love that, because I think there's just, there's no, you can't fathom or guess what's going to happen next with that. And I absolutely love that. So in talking about the characters, we've had at least 10 issues plus the free comic book day that you shared with these characters that are mysterious and complex. We have Sheriff of Nottingham, Robin Hood, Maid Marian, Guy Gisborne. For you as a writer, which character would you say that you're most excited about, and which one's the most challenging?
Hmm. Um, I find Tuck and Gisborne challenging because I want to make sure that they still have a place in the story, and sometimes like I fear that they just get outshone by Marian and Robin and Ev, and like I'm hoping that when we hit volume 3 that that part of it will hit you hard, but
Mhm.
we'll see. I'm still outlining. But yeah, like Robin, Marian, and the sheriff are such a joy to write that um and I just like the dynamic between the three of them. That's
Mhm.
what all like led into that three-way sword fight at the end of volume 1.
Yes.
Um and yeah, it's a really fun dynamic, and we'll see how that dynamic changes over the course of volume 3 as well, which I'm very excited for. I've been writing the outline backwards.
Oh, there you
So
go.
I started with the last issue and I'm working my way backwards.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
honestly, I did tear up a little bit at the end of volume 3. But um yeah, it's a fun thing going, okay, well, I know where these characters end and I want to know where they are now. Let's fill in the blanks.
Yeah, yeah. That's it. So I'm going to ask you a question here with what you just said, but I want to go back to when you were talking about, Blackthorn and Robin Hood and Marian with that scene. I got to say that I could tell you loved writing that part because I think for me, that was just such a pinnacle moment in volume 1 in that I think the relationship dynamic and the power structures and just everything that accumulated led up to that moment. And it was just such a powerful part of volume 1 that I absolutely loved. And I could tell that you loved writing that part because it was something that was just so powerful, and like it had like all the emotions with it. It had like the suspense and the mystery and everything with it. And I gotta say that was my favorite part of volume 1 as well too. So I could tell that you really enjoyed writing those characters. When you were talking about volume 3 and how you're starting, with the end first and working your way back, um, do you and do comic writers in general, do you usually like start with the beginning and work your way to the end usually, or is there what's a normal process for you or for other writers, that maybe for our listeners, don't know how that process worked in the comics writing world? Can you shed some light on, how that usually works, and maybe at least for you, in terms of, what works for you, what kind of goes into that?
When I'm outlining, I will usually go from start to finish
Mm-hmm.
because it allows you to build elements. I'll go to start from start to finish, and then I'll go back and make the ending work with the rest of it, and kind of neaten it up. When I'm scripting, I
Mm-hmm.
usually write the first couple of pages and the last couple of pages, and any scenes that are like stuck in my mind as things that need to get out of my brain and onto the paper, and then I'll fill in all the blanks in between that.
Right.
Some people work like me. Other people think I'm deranged for doing it that way. But like with that fight scene at the end of volume 1, the dialogue involved in that entire confrontation,
Mm-hmm.
there's probably like 4 or 5 pages more of that dialogue that ended up on the cutting room floor.
Mm-hmm.
And like those conversations, the kind of conversations that are like really the fulcrum of the thematic and plot elements are the ones that obviously get writers really excited.
Right.
And so
Yeah.
that's what I jump to first. I'm
Mm-hmm.
like, okay, well, how do we get here? And how do we get from here to,
Mm-hmm.
some sort of resolution? And yeah, so there are bits and pieces that I leap to first because they're the most exciting, and that gets me excited about the other parts that may not be initially as exciting, but how do I make them exciting so that I'm excited writing them, so that people are excited reading them?
Yeah. So when you're talking about those critical moments in the story and everything, and you have to, fill in the details that leads up to it later, do you ever find yourself realizing that when you first had that critical moment and then you wrote it down, that it had to change later on because the details leading up to it just wouldn't work, and that you had to make those adjustments? And when that happens, like, do you get disappointed, or is it one of those things where it's like, no, it actually got better because of that?
I mean, it always ends up better because of that. Because like I can, especially these characters, like the dialogue is so rich
Hmm.
and the characters are so fertile that I could sit there and write pages and pages of conversations between them.
Right. Right.
Um, but the reality is, this is a comic book, and like people are going to fall asleep if I just have slabs and slabs of text. Um, but which is why I always try to contextualize that with the stakes. And I think that fight scene is just like a perfect example of that.
Hmm.
That like Robin is kind of like raving at Ev while he's holding a knife to Marian's throat and like telling her to shut the hell up.
I
um,
love that.
and so like the more he talks, the more the suspense ramps up, because like what is he gonna do, what is the sheriff gonna do, uh and all you can see is them like firing off verbal shots at each other. You're like, what's gonna happen,
And it is
um
such a suspenseful moment too. Like I remember feeling the tension reading through those panels, and it was just, I've said it before already, so I apologize, but it's just so well done. I really love that part of the story. So yeah, I can see that. One last question for you, and I wanted to ask this because I don't think we asked this in the last episode, but the story is called Nottingham, and in the story, we know that the Sheriff of Nottingham's last name is Blackthorn. I'm just kind of curious, how come the story is called Nottingham and not Blackthorn, or the tales of Blackthorn, or even Sheriff of Nottingham? Is there a reason why maybe it had to be Nottingham and not Blackthorn? Is it just because people recognize Nottingham and not the last name of the person?
uh Part of it is that. So
Okay.
my original title for the series was Nottingham Noir. um and
Oh.
then and then we kind of went back and forth on it, and like um uh my editor and the then managing editor at Mad Cave, we had a discussion about it, and they were like, well, can we go with Sheriff of Nottingham? And I'm like, probably not, for legal reasons. There is a board game, you won't be able to get the trademarks. uh,
Mm.
I'm like, I said it's unlikely, but give it a shot. And they took it to legal. Legal were like, no, it's not a good idea. And so we ended up on just Nottingham. I got to tell you, I think I hit the jackpot with like naming the sheriff Everett Blackthorn. I don't know where it came from. It was. It's one of those moments where I can't point to where that name came from,
Hmm.
but I feel like it was. It just fits so well that I now can't imagine having named the character anything else.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah,
Yeah.
you kind of feel his hunched back when you have to say the name Everett Blackthorn. Like you
Oh
you
yeah.
feel the hunted back. You can smell the greasy hair. Like
Yeah. I
yeah. So that was a stroke of luck on my part.
Yeah, I gotta say, I think that's a great name for him. And to be honest, I don't think I can ever see any other Sheriff of Nottingham in any story, new or old, without now thinking that that person's name is Blackthorn. So I think that was a great name. Is very fitting for your character in the story. But I think the person of Sheriff of Nottingham, I think, just fits that very well. So I love the fact that you were able to come up with that name, and I think it works really well. But yeah, I was just kind of curious why that title name, since it's so central around Blackthorn and everything. So I was just kind of curious if part of that was a marketing plan and part of it was logistics and things like that. So and I figured it was kind of a combination of those. Yeah.
And none of
It
them,
always
since
is,
we started with Nottingham in the title, but
Right. Yeah. So and it works though, because I think, with that title, people know what that's going to be about just looking at it. And I remember, that first issue in the volume with that cover art, it just grabs your attention because it's not what you were expecting at all with everything. And so I think it just really captures not just the name, but the art captures the essence and spirit of the story. And so I think it worked out to your benefit, and it delivered, exactly what you wanted it to. So I think it's a fantastic read. So, well, David, thank you for coming back on the show.
I feel like we should have talked about Shane a little.
When volume 3 comes out, we should do an interview with the whole creative team. I think we should do that if everybody's available.
Yeah, absolutely keen to do that. But just shout out to Shane Conrad Falk,
yes,
who is a master and also a fantastic human being, and the best partner in medieval crime one could ask for in this business. Luca Romano, who is our very intense, very Italian colorist, who is just also a joy, and Brian Hawkins, fantastic editor and amazing comics creator in his own right. So should also go follow all those people.
Yeah.
Because they spend just as much time, if not more, time making Nottingham happen. So very grateful to all of them.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Well, David, thanks for coming on the show again. It was a blast having you back on to talk about Volume 2. Before I let you go, can you let us know where we can find you online if we want to connect with you through social media or just be able to see what you're up to?
Yeah, so the best place is on Twitter. My Twitter handle is at David T. Hazan, or you can find my website at www.davidhazan.com.
Awesome. I'll make sure to put that in the show notes. So, David, again, thank you for coming back on the show. It was a blast talking to you about Nottingham. I wish you all the best of success with the future of that story.
Thank you very much.
And that wraps up another episode of The Capson Life. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button. You can follow us on social media at Capson Life. For more information about us and all of our previous episodes, visit thecapsonlife.com.